Okay, for this video, I want to talk about Melky Cabrera. Wait, Melky Cabrera? Who cares about that guy? I mean, no offense to the milkman, but he's not exactly a superstar. So, to explain why I want to talk about Cabrera, perhaps it's useful to do a quick recap of the myths we've discussed so far in this series, using some helpful question words: who, what, when, where, why, and how. Who? Who used steroids in the first place? Everyone, right? Certainly all the big sluggers of the steroid era. Well, no. Actually, the evidence we have suggests that steroid use never exceeded 10% of the players and was highly concentrated among pitchers and guys on the fringe of the league, not all-stars. What? What did steroids actually cause? Home runs, right? Certainly steroids were the cause of the league-wide increase in home runs. Well, no. Actually, the evidence shows that the increase in home runs was A, too sudden, happening almost overnight in mid-1993, and B, too consistent across the league to be confined to a specific subset of steroid users. In actual fact, there doesn't appear to be any discernible difference in home runs among confirmed steroid users as compared to the rest of the league. When was this so-called steroid era? Presumably the steroid era refers to a period when steroid use was supposedly widespread, usually sometime in the 1990s. But the dates here are actually quite slippery. As I mentioned in a previous video, an anonymous survey of players conducted by the Players Union in 1991 found less than 1% of the league said they had used steroids in the past year. When testing began in the minors in 2001 and in the major leagues in 2003, the positive rate started off around 5 to 7%, and then fell to below 1% when punishments were put in place. Is it possible that the rates went from 1% in the early 90s to widespread in the mid-90s before plummeting back down to 5% in the early aughts? I suppose you can believe that if you want to, but there's no evidence for that at all, and it's much more likely that the rates were always in the single digits, even at the peak of steroid use. Wherever. I don't actually have much to say about where you do steroids, so there's no myths to talk about here. Why? Why did players use steroids? I keep getting a version of this question in the comments. If steroids don't work, then why would so many players use them? To which I just have to say, oh, you sweet summer child. Have you met human beings? We do stupid things that don't work all the time. People used to sacrifice animals to change the weather. Take a walk down the aisle of any drugstore or GNC and tell me that the things people do for their health are always smart and effective. People, and especially athletes, are constantly trying new fad diets or workout techniques or whatever unproven health craze is the latest thing. That doesn't mean these things work. So why did a few hundred players use steroids over the course of a decade or so? Because someone told them it might work and a few pros were just desperate enough to try. That just leaves how. How did steroids supposedly work for baseball players? The myth answer is that steroids work like Popeye's spinach. The player pops them and then his muscles get really big and he uses those muscles to hit big, long home runs. But of course, that's not really correct. Which brings us back to Melky Cabrera. Melky Cabrera failed a drug test in 2012 and was later linked to the biogenesis scandal. Thanks to his cooperation with federal investigators into Anthony Bosch's clinic, we actually know a lot about Cabrera's steroid use. We know he was being treated in 2011 and 2012, which just happened to be the best seasons of his career to that point. This certainly seems like the smokiest of smoking guns we could possibly ask for. Here's someone who we know used steroids, and we know when he used steroids, and we know what he used, and we can see in his stats that they helped him. But what's notable is how those steroids work, because in Melky's case, they didn't work at all like the myth says they work. It's not like Cabrera showed up in 2011 suddenly all jacked and hitting home runs. His power went up slightly, but only slightly. He hit 18 home runs in 2011, which was 5 more than his previous career high, but not exactly a noticeable power surge. 5 of his teammates on the Kansas City Royals, not exactly a slugging team that year, hit more home runs than him. And then the next year he was on pace to hit around 16 home runs when his suspension was handed down. What actually changed in those seasons was his batting average. He was hitting way more singles and doubles than normal. And so that increased his batting average and his on-base percentage and his slugging percentage, taking his OPS plus from 83 in 2010 before the steroids to 121 in 2011 and 157 in 2012 at the time of the suspension. Instead of turning a fringe player into a home run derby winner the way people think steroids are supposed to work, the drugs only made Cabrera a better version of the player he already was. The standard response to this is to do some vague hand-waving thing where you say, well, if steroids help you hit home runs, they can probably turn you into a better hitter in general. His big muscles probably helped him hit the ball harder, and that's what helped him be a better hitter. But this is really a significant change, and for what it's worth, there's not much evidence of this. For one, he actually didn't put on any visible muscle. If you look at pictures of Melky Cabrera from 2011 and 2012, he doesn't look any bigger than he looked in 2009 and 2010. And while we don't have StatCast data on exit velocity from those years, his line drive percentage was actually down in 2011 and then roughly career average in 2012. So there's not much to suggest he was hitting the ball harder. But the bigger problem with this kind of explanation is that we're essentially data dredging or p-hacking. P-hacking, if you don't know, is a data science term for when you test something against so many variables that it's bound to turn up some kind of effect for one of those variables just by happenstance. And by changing the initial claim from steroids help you hit home runs to steroids make you a better hitter in general, you're almost rigging the question so that you can credit steroids for any statistical increase, even if we have to ignore that how question we were talking about. Now, I can already hear you yelling at me. You're saying, come on, Melky Cabrera just happened to have his best years on steroids? And you might expect me to give you some mealy-mouthed answer about correlation not meaning causation, but no, I'm not going to be stubborn. I see your point. And I agree that steroids almost certainly helped Melky Cabrera. I worry that sometimes in this series I've come off as someone who doesn't think steroids do anything for anyone, and obviously that's not true. So to be clear, steroids do have real effects on the body. But I think that how question of how they affect baseball players is a little more complicated than just steroids go in, muscles get big, balls go far. And Melky Cabrera is actually a useful illustration of that complication. It's easy to understand why people believe this theory about steroids making people stronger and that leading to more home runs. After all, steroids are used to increase testosterone levels, which help the body add muscle and gain strength. I'm not denying that. And all else being equal, being stronger is better for a professional athlete. The complication is that when it comes to the body and drug use, all else is never really equal. Using steroids to add muscle comes with some serious risks and downsides, especially the risk of injury, and especially for a baseball player playing every single day. Those downsides, which also include things like changes to your swing and stiffness on the field, are likely to outweigh any benefit you get from an increase in muscle mass, especially when you consider, as I've argued in previous videos, that there just isn't as much value as people seem to think to a hitter adding upper body muscle mass. For one, you don't hit home runs with your biceps. That's oversimplifying a little bit, but most of a hitter's power comes from his lower body. There's a reason why most of the best home run hitters in baseball history, whether that's Hank Aaron, or Willie Mays, or Ted Williams, or Ken Griffey Jr., or Shohei Ohtani, were not built like bodybuilders. Obviously, all these guys were strong and great athletes, but it's not the kind of strength or skill you can replicate or add with steroids. Which brings me to another point, which is that we are talking about professional athletes here. They are not like you and me. When we talk about steroids, people tend to extrapolate way too much from their own experience. Yes, if some guy you know from the gym or the bar shows up one day suddenly looking jacked out of his mind, or if some random actor or comedian you know gets all ripped to play a superhero or something, then it's not crazy to think that guy's probably on steroids. After all, to make that kind of body transformation so quickly, you need elevated levels of testosterone, which steroids can give you. But testosterone levels already vary within the population. They are not the same from person to person, and professional athletes are likely to have higher levels than some guy off the street. And that's to say nothing of all the other advantages that a professional athlete might have, like advanced nutrition, access to professional training and elite services, all of which make it easier for them to put on muscle and stay in shape. In my last video on Brady Anderson, one of the comments I got a lot was something to the effect of, "Look how ripped he was. You don't get that physique naturally." And what people really seem to mean by this is, you don't get that physique naturally. But Brady Anderson is not like you. He might not be a Hall of Famer, but he's still a professional athlete, and he might have physical advantages that you do not have, believe it or not. A lot of fans seem to be under the impression that just because something is unusual, it somehow isn't possible for professional athletes to do without drugs. But a professional baseball player can probably add muscle faster and easier than the average person can. Which brings us back to Melky Cabrera, because he's sort of an interesting exception here. Remember, just because most pro athletes have an easier time adding muscle doesn't mean they all do, and Cabrera was actually someone who was criticized throughout his career for being undisciplined and overweight. I remember when he first came up with the Yankees in 2005 and then again in 2006. He had a lot of potential, but he never seemed to put it all together. One reason the Yankees were always looking to trade him, allegedly, is that he was supposedly a bad influence on his teammate and friend, Robinson Cano. There was the sense that both of them needed to buckle down and focus and stay in shape. For what it's worth, Cano did have a breakout season after Melky left. And after Cabrera was traded to Atlanta, his first stop after New York, he hit only .255 and was again criticized for being too pudgy. It was only after the Braves finally cut him that he went to biogenesis. And remember, weight loss was one of the things that people, not just athletes, but average people, went to Tony Bosch and biogenesis for. And one of the things testosterone treatments can do is help you put on muscle without adding fat. In other words, it seems reasonable to conclude that Bosch's treatments helped Cabrera get leaner, even if they didn't necessarily help him get any bigger. This is our new answer to that how question. The ability to help someone like Cabrera finally get in shape was the thing that helped take him from a talented prospect with unfulfilled potential to an above-average hitter. This is a steroid success story, but to be clear, it's a very modest one. For one, he went from a slightly below-average player to a slightly above-average player. People make a big deal about Melky's 2012 season when he was an all-star and led the league in hits and was second in the league in batting average before he was suspended, but a lot of that was really luck. He had a batting average on balls in play of .379 that season, which is unreasonably high and not really sustainable, especially when you consider that his ground ball rate was over 50%. When you're hitting that many ground balls, you should not be hitting .380 on balls in play. His batting average had actually already fallen 30 points from his season high at the time of his suspension, and probably would have continued to fall had he played the full year. 2012 was really an outlier compared to the rest of Cabrera's career, where he was about a 120 OPS plus kind of guy. In other words, steroids didn't turn Cabrera into a superstar. He was just a slightly better version of what he already was. I don't say this to excuse his cheating, but I think it's important to keep the stakes in perspective here. And remember, this is as clear of a smoking gun as you almost ever get when it comes to steroids, and the before and after changes are just not that drastic. The lessons that people tend to draw from an example like Melky, that is, a player who doesn't fit the mythic idea of a steroid user as a big slugger, is to cast a wider net of suspicion, to say that even more players were probably guilty and even more things were likely the result of steroids. Not just home runs, but singles and doubles and stolen bases. Not just sluggers, but every player having a good year. But this is precisely backwards. What Cabrera's example shows is that we ought to question our original assumptions about what steroids can do, even when they are supposedly effective. Cabrera had a very specific problem related to weight and discipline. Steroids helped and were an unfair shortcut to dealing with it, but his example should lower your estimate of what steroids can do, not raise them, because he's so clearly not an example of a roided out slugger, despite the fact that we have all this detail about his drug use. The idea that we can extrapolate from Melky Cabrera's example to the kinds of effects people attribute to steroids, like a massive league-wide increase in home runs, every record-setting season, and entire Hall of Fame careers, is just not justified. It's just another myth.